But there are some excellent sessions going on in the industry talk stage, the other hall, starting at 3:30 p.m. A keynote from Grabio, our partners for that session, on how sports production will shape up in 2019 and beyond. Certainly for someone who works in television, that is of great interest to me. I might learn a few things from that myself, so that is definitely worth a look in. Back here on the main stage at this World Football Summit Asia, well, sports industries, and in this case, the football industry, doesn't simply create itself. It has to be built, it has to be supported, it has to be nurtured at every level, from our facilitators on the ground in all roles, all the way up to government and institutional level. They're the ones who work the room. They drive investment into sports and development. But what benefits does a country get from that development, and how do policymakers and decision makers enhance the impact of that investment? So our first afternoon roundtable is entitled Sports Development versus Country Development. So please welcome our moderator, Eric Gottschalk, Chief Executive Officer and founder of MMC Sports Marketing. And with him, our trio of speakers, Domeka Garamendi, Head of MA Development at the Asian Football Confederation, Vivek Sethia, Founder and Chief Executive Officer of India on Track, and Harvey Arman, Director of Asia and Oceania at Double Pass Consulting. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome your panel. Eric, the floor is yours.
Microphone? Yes. So the microphone is working, so this is very good. So thank you very much, first of all, for the nice introduction and for all of us to be here at the World Football Summit. I mean, this is a great privilege and it's a well put together event, so thank you very much. Our topic today is the sports development versus the country development, and we're looking again at the private and the government investment in sports. We're looking at what drives sports investment, and we're looking at the goals of why do we actually have sports investment. And we have a very nice, diverse panel here with different backgrounds. So we have a European perspective of coming really from the grassroots development level. We have an agency perspective looking at India, and obviously we have from the AFC a governing and the rights holders perspective. When my company started the Sport Industry Awards in 2015 in the Philippines, the government was looking at trying to reach out into the sports industry in order to get contacts, because they were pitching for hosting the Southeast Asian Games. When we moved our event to Thailand, Thailand was just trying to launch their sports tourism strategy. So my first question for my group here today is really, what are the drivers and the motivations to invest into sports from a private perspective and from a governmental perspective? And I don't know, Domeka, maybe you want
Eric,
to start
thank
off?
you. Good afternoon, everyone. I think maybe the most important strategic objective of a government or of the private sector for investing in sports, I think, is basically country development, but it's country development through sports development, right? When I mean country development, it's not only just country development, but there's also sports tourism involved. There is this, the social side to it. It all leads up into country development. So I think that's the most important, that's basically the most important objective when it comes to government investment and private investment.
Okay, thank you.
So good evening, good afternoon, everyone. From India perspective, the sports investment on a government side is divided into two, actually. There's a central government that has a different objective, and then there's state governments, which are more like regional governments. So the central government now is started to think about India as a superpower, and how can we perform so poorly at the Olympics or World Cup or so on, not qualify for major events. And they want to invest in sports purely from a PR perspective, to be able to say that if we are competing with China or the US or large European countries as an economy, as a global economy, can we be also competing with them at the global stage? At the state level, it's a little different. They have various micro agendas. Health and wellness is one. Building the communities is the other. However, they lack funds, and hence they need private investors and private support from corporates and so on to be able to support them. And the private players are still looking at this from more charitable front, as against an ROI, to be honest. The ROI is mainly about being able to do the right thing in the communities, to be able to engage the communities from a PR perspective, not necessarily the business of sport. And that's how kind of India is split. It's still very ad hoc. It's not one unique strategy across the center and the states, and that's how it is right now.
Great.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. First of all, thank you for having me. Double Pass Belgium is a 20-year-old company based out of Brussels, and for 20 years we've focused on talent development systems in football. We've had the privilege to work with more than 800 professional and grassroots football clubs all around the world. In our opinion, the main return on investment for governments and institutions come from social capital and economic capital. And we are convinced by this by working with Ministry of Sports, Ministry of Educations, federations, leagues, and eventually football clubs all around the world. When I talk about political and social capital, we're talking about bringing the communities together. We're talking about bridging generations, and essentially we are talking about creating national pride and eventually investing in the health and education for the next generation. If I take Vietnam for an example, under 21's championship in Vietnam, that final against Uzbekistan in Hanoi, we see more than 100,000 people on the streets cheering for the under 21's national team, and this sense of pride and unity is formed by nothing but football. And in our opinion, consistently for 20 years, we believe it all starts from talent development. Secondly, economic capital. This is enhanced by investing in the youth too. If we take Germany for an example, Bundesliga are partners for 13 years now, and I've met some of our colleagues from Bundesliga. They've done a fantastic job in investing in their youth. They had a plan, they executed this plan. From 2006 onwards, it's the increase of the productivity of their academies that created more attractive games, that brought direct popularity into watching their football matches and created a lot of economic capital. So hand in hand, it all starts from talent development.
Great. So next question is, who's responsible to drive the sports development? And again, I'm sure that we have a lot of regional differences just because of funds being available. But Domeka, what do you think? What's your opinion?
My opinion is, I guess it's both the private and the public sectors need to be drivers of sports development. Of course, depending on where you are and depending on the country, some countries it will be more the government, others it will be more the private sector. It really depends. And I think in Asia, because we're such a big continent and with very vast differences, you will see in many countries it's the government, and the other countries you will see it's the private sector. So I think it's really depending on the situation at hand.
So sport development, when we talk about sport development, it can go from absolute wellness and health and to grassroots to youth and then elite and professional. And I think it's, from India perspective, it's really impossible to look at this entire spectrum, that burden to be given to one private or public. I think it has to be a great combination of both. I think the burden right now is more towards private than public. Public investment needs to increase on the development side. It has to be a balance between both, and that's how development will be better in India. And that's where I think we are lacking as a country. Is there isn't a concerted one vision, one strategy approach with all parties coming together and looking at a focused kind of vision around development.
How's on a government level, just a follow-up question, the strategy been conducted? So who plans the strategy in India? And is there a government strategy for sports that's then been filtered down?
So the challenge that we face is that the central government, which ideally should have been responsible for a centralized strategy, their bylaws state that sport is a state subject. By state, we mean regions, right? And when it becomes a state subject, every region is kind of free to set out their own strategy. So some regions have a strategy of saying, let's pick a sport, let's excel in that sport. So for example, there's a region called Haryana, which excels in wrestling, right? And we have Olympic medalists from that region, and they just go focus on one or two sports, right? And then there are other regions focusing on other sports. But then there are other regions that have absolutely no idea, and they would have loved to have some central direction. I think the way it is structured is causing a rift in terms of a unified strategy, and that's where the challenge is. There are funds Of course, we are probably not one of the top investing countries in the world when it comes to organized sports. However, there are some funds which are just spent on random sporadic projects. And if it all comes together, the results can be much better.
Right. I think, Eric, most importantly, people drive investments. It's the visionaries on top and the leaders of a country, of a regional government, of a local government, who can be determined to invest for the long term, that can create all sorts of circumstances for the next generation, which eventually brings back sustainable return on investment. Governments and federations, what can they do to facilitate such kind of drive, such kind of stimulators? First of all, they need to have infrastructure. Infrastructure are the basis for kids from football to other sports to conduct their usual football activities. Grassroots programs need to be created to facilitate their involvement as football players, both professionally or recreationally. And of course, we look at top sports environments that needs to be created and facilitated. Such circumstances let the players in lower pyramids to engage further. And again, we look at quality assurance that makes sure all of this is running in a productive manner. None of this can happen without the leaders realizing that the treasure lays in the next generation. And this comes with a plan. It always starts with a plan, and you have to execute this plan and come back and revise this plan. If you look at the success of Belgium, if you look at the success of Germany, if you look at success right now, Hungary is doing extraordinarily well. This all starts with a visionary, a group of ambitious leaders on top.
Can I ask you then, who triggers this thought process? What triggers actually the investment? Okay, you have people that are, as you said, on the top that have the vision. But where does this vision come from? Where does the need come from? Who triggers the need or the goal of investing into sports?
For us at Double Pass, we have a mission statement. We believe first thing we do before we go into any organization is inspire the leaders, is inspire the people sitting around the table that makes the decisions. And then we connect, and then we try to innovate together with these people. People are triggered by different means. People are triggered by ambition, people are triggered by patriotism, some people are triggered with compassion, and of course, their admiration for the immense potential and opportunity that our young children can create. I believe this has to come from a hearty incentive. It has to come from the heart that you believe this can be achieved.
Vivek, let me ask you the same question. Maybe it's a little bit more radical, but do you think that the investment in sport is also triggered from a need? I mean, you mentioned before that you want to compete on an international level and you might not winning the medals. Is this maybe a trigger or?
So on the private side, it has been triggered in the past and continues to trigger purely from an emotion. It triggers from an emotion of why as a country we can't do better when it comes to global competitions or tournaments or events. On the government side, it's an unfortunate reality, but it gets triggered by elections. It gets triggered by PR opportunities. It gets triggered by, is this the right thing to do to be able to tell the people that I'm doing some good work? And when it gets triggered for the wrong reasons, it gets changed when the people change, right? It's not usually triggered at the point where this is right for this particular set of region, and let's just look at a 10, 15, 20-year vision around winning medals or qualifying for the World Cup. It's like, can I get a little more votes by doing this? And when I move away, then somebody else comes with a different agenda. And bear in mind that there are many challenges that sit in our country, and sport is probably priority number 55, right? There's issues which governments have to tackle. So because it's triggered by the wrong reasons, especially in the government side, it's not creating lasting impact.
I'm sorry that I stay on with you. It's become a very quiet in terms of all the franchising and all the franchise league models in India. Investment in sports, is that not also driven by commercial objectives or by commercial gains? I mean, the IPL is obviously extremely successful, while vice versa, the IPTL, the tennis league, has folded after a year or 2 years. So,
I think there's an absolute obsession towards franchise-based sports sports models in India. IPL, absolutely, totally successful. But bear in mind, most franchises, if not all franchises, kept investing for 10 years till a big TV deal was kind of structured, and then it became positive. I think there are some sports, including football, where the model can work and is showing some positive signs. However, for smaller tournament-style events, this model definitely is not working as much because there is no commercial long-term sustainability. Of course, lots of people are putting in the money to support the sport. However, from a long-term perspective, they just don't want to continue to lose with no sight of sustainable future. So, for example, in football, in ISL, if you look at of course, all the franchise owners are investing and they are losing money. But if you look at the levels of investment that have gone lesser over the years, and there is a path that maybe in another 5 to 7 years, it will become sustainable. However, tennis, the IPTL that you referred to, there was no path whatsoever. And it's a one-week tournament where everything is dependent on Nadal or Federer playing, right? And there is no long-term vision around it. And that's where lots of leagues like hockey and even badminton are just losing the plot by saying, okay, IPL worked and the franchise-based model works and let's just do this.
Great. Domeka, obviously with the AFC, it's a little bit of a different situation. But let me ask you the question. So you need investment, you need the funds in order for you to achieve the objectives that the AFC has with, and then your department with the member association services. Obviously, it's very important that this investment comes in. But how does it affect you? Because the AFC has obviously a commercial partner that has different objectives than maybe the AFC has by developing the sport. How do you manage this?
Well, I think it's when you think of our commercial partner trying to generate revenue because of the rights that they hold, I think they're solely looking at the activities that AFC does on a regular basis, which are basically the Asian Cup, the Champions League, the AFC Cup. After they're able to generate that revenue from there and it's given back to development, we look at it at the very development point of view where we help our member associations try to improve their operations, try to professionalize how they do their work. When it comes to government and private investment, I guess they're both very important when it comes to sports development and country development for the main reason as it gives access to resources. And normally people think, yes, access to resources, which is always going to be financial or funding. I think what's also important is access to infrastructure and facilities. And the third is access to manpower, right? Access to funding. You have funding from the Sports Commission, of course, the Health Ministry, Education Ministry. From the private sector, you'll have access to their CSR budgets. You'll have access to their marketing and advertising budgets. I think something that I think that needs to be highlighted is when we say access to facilities and infrastructure, it's not just the construction of stadia, but more like access to the local park, right? Access to school pitches, so that when there is a venue that you can develop and organize football activities, you are then contributing to sports development because you're doing it at the grassroots level. And from doing it from grassroots level, you'll do it quite often. You will then be able to determine who are the elite, right? And when it comes to the access to manpower, you have manpower when it comes to the education ministry. You have X number of school teachers all around the country. You can use them to start grassroots projects in their schools.
Yeah. But the AFC vision or the objective is really the long-term development, while your commercial partner is mainly looking at their limited contract period and trying to maximize.
Right.
How do you manage these different objectives?
Well, I think that's for us to manage. I think it's going to be not difficult, but I think it's going to have to be a very collaborative process. Although they're not directly related, they're indirectly related. There has to be a lot of discussion with our rights holder to see that it's not all about generating revenue, but there also has to be a development side to it. Because if we're not able to develop the football, then they're not going to be able to sell it. So it's a big cycle, and it's basically a hand-in-hand agreement and partnership.
Great. I had a question now for Vivek. what's from your point of view, the difference between the different investments from the private sector and the government sector into sports?
So I think the difference predominantly is on objectives and private and also the quantum of investments, because the government has a significantly larger budget, which if all, like I said, pulled together can create positive impact in the country. And for the private sectors, it is purely about, can I pitch in and create something? So a very good example is Reliance Sports. It's one of the largest private organization in our country, and they've taken over the entire space of football, saying that we are not getting enough from the government side, we're not getting enough from the federation side, and India hasn't been able to move the needle positively on football. And we are going to take over this entire ecosystem, invest ourselves, bring some key stakeholders and partners and help them invest, bring the right broadcasters, right marketing partners, right franchisee owners, and then try to create a change in the ecosystem of the entire country. Now, of course, if this was done from a governmental angle, they would have had some different objectives and get a different set of resources. From a private perspective, they really had to leverage a lot of their relationships and lots of their partners to bring in and try to do something which the government could have possibly done. Having said that, their objective is not necessarily commercial in this, because they are the largest organization in India and they want to see India excel in various sports, not just football. And football is one of the many investments they've made. And football is largely driven through this private investment and private vision. In this case, having a great vision and having the great trigger for an individual or a set of individuals who see this as a long term really helped, what Harvey mentioned. In the case of governments, because people change, we've seen that there are people who've passionately supported a project, and because they've changed, the project dies. The private investment has helped that. And the fact that Reliance is putting this kind of effort has helped, because they are the single vision focused on getting this right. Of course, we have a long way to go. But in the 5 years of development of football in India, since the new league ISL has started, we've seen tremendous changes. We've seen how players are getting developed much better. We've seen how professional clubs are being run. We've seen now youth academies, grassroots programs, and so on. And at the professional level, the impact has come. India's ranking has grown over the last 5 years. When we hit top 100 last year. We hosted the Under-17 World Cup. There's aspiration now of India playing the World Cup. And lots of people who are fans of the sport have started to believe that that's possible. Whereas a few years ago, that just was a dream, and we used to say that before we die, we would love to see India play the World Cup. So the private investment has helped from that perspective.
Would you say it helped, or is that the main driver?
In football, definitely is the main driver. In other sports, is helped.
Okay, right.
Sure.
Harvey, yeah.
In talent development, we think it is critical that both parties are aligned together and work towards the same direction. Yet their motives might be different and the results that they expect might be different. Yet if you would like to be successful in producing more and better football players in your country and receive return on investment, you have to be aligned. Yet their expertise might be different. Take Central Asia and Asia, for an example. Model of PPP is becoming more and more popular, yet governments are proposing things that they have resources that they are privileged to have to promote private sectors to invest and dive into developing football especially for the talent and for the next generation more and more. The hardware of your pitches, your equipment, things that Domeka has mentioned, these are the necessary ingredients in the kitchen if you would like to cook. Without this, you would not be able to move. For some private investors, these things might not be immediately available, yet government should be brave enough and should be ambitious enough to say, this is my share of the contribution to build a state-of-the-art talent development system. Yet private companies could also look at the processes that they can invest in In processes, I mean the human resources and the way of doing things into an organization. Because at the end of the day, it's the people who are doing the job, and it's the people we should be investing in. Take an academy for an example. It's always when you invest in the education of the leaders of an academy, of the club, that leads to better education for the academy directors. Essentially, you come up with better coaches, and lastly, you have better players. Without the software, the big engine will not move, and without the engine, software has nowhere to perform.
So how should countries who have smaller budgets for the development of sports, then how are they able to compete with countries that have much larger budgets? And again, if you're looking at, for instance, example, Philippines versus Singapore, there's more than a couple 100 times more investment in Singapore into sports than it would be, for instance, in the Philippines.
When we talk about sports, it's always a competition. Federations are competing with federations, clubs are competing with clubs, and of course, like any arena, like any game, players always have strengths, players always have disadvantages. So before you take any action to invest, before you take any action to either do replacement of your staff, to say, I would like to change my strategy, we advise that you first look at what is happening in your organization. Sometimes what you think is going really well might not be your best strength. What you think is really missing should not be your priority. So what we should advise is let an objective view come in and advise you from 360 degrees what is missing and what can be strengthened. Secondly, what you need to do is set up a strategy. Utilize all the resources you have to have a strategic positioning, to have a direction and have a path to say, this is the way I would like to develop my young players, maximizing the resources I have. Following this, you should set up your structure, the people who could do this, and eventually implement this plan. If you are running short on resources and say, this is all I've got, what I would advise is use this money, use this resource to inspire the people who can facilitate you. There are always ambitious people in your country who love their country. There are always people who would like to devote their lives into football development and essentially make themselves proud and make their people proud. Convince those people to say, trust in us and trust in your people to do a good job. You can bring in European expertise, you can bring in global know-how, but it's you who have to do the job. It won't be the Europeans, it won't be the outsiders. They can help you, but it is you who have to do this.
Domeka, how does it affect, let's say, when you work with a federation, let's say like the Maldives, and how would you advise them to develop and to invest versus, countries like China or Japan, which are much more developed on the football level?
Well, just to add to what Harvey said is, I know he said that you need to first start with an assessment of the organization. But what I think should also be done is an assessment of where the sport is at the moment, at that particular time in a particular country. I think that will give you a good basis of where the sport is and how you can help develop it, right? And from there, you come up with a strategic plan, which I think is very essential. Strategic plan does not have to be a very convoluted one. It doesn't have to be a very complicated one. Sometimes the simpler the plan, the better. And from there, depending on what funds you have to set certain priorities, right? And probably in smaller countries, they can't do all 10 priorities at the same time. They'll probably say, maybe we do the first 1 to 3. Once we've achieved 1 to 3, we can move on then to the next 4 to 6. But it's really an introspect study of where they are and what the possible opportunities are when it comes to limited funding. So they both have to look at the public side of it, the private side of it, and I guess they also have to take into account the culture that it's happening in. If football is not a culture yet in a certain country, then you will probably have to choose wisely really on how you're going to spend your funding.
Good. Looking at examples of different sports investment strategies, and I'm looking at the region here. Again, in the Philippines, for instance, they're looking to try to bring football players with Philippine passports all over the world to strengthen the national team. Singapore has a strategy of investing in Formula One, WTA just finished, they have the marathons and they have their fitness passport where they're getting the community going. And then you're looking at China, who wants to win the World Cup in 2050. They're in the process of building about 60,000 venues, And we know that Alibaba spent more than 100 million euros in buying a stake in Evergrande. There's also this 80-20 rule, and there was a comparison between Holland and Australia. Australia in the last 2 decades won more than 150 medals on an Olympic level, while Holland won about half of the number of medals. But both countries, interesting enough, have changed their strategies. While Australia won so many more medals, they are now looking into putting more money into grassroots developments, while Holland, which won less medals, is now trying to put more money into elite sports. And my question is, does investment into elite sports still pay off?
So, I think I want to tie this in with the last question also that you asked, that to have in India what has worked is a very focused approach. So states where there is a culture of a particular sport, there is talent for a particular sport, the states have actually just invested in that sport with a view to bring a medal. Like I mentioned, Haryana for wrestling, there's a state called Hyderabad, which produces lots of badminton players. We had a silver medalist in the Olympics last year. If you look at the academy structure now there and the investment, both from private and public side, there's been tremendous. So in essence, when the results, which are more visible, they come out, lots of governments tend to say that they pay off. It really depends, the answer of that is really depends on the objectives. Like my organization works on the grassroots level, and the objective is for kids to go out and play and learn the sport and fall in love with a beautiful sport, whether it's football, basketball, tennis, badminton. And then if they become serious about that sport, great, and then we pass them on to the relevant stakeholders. And the objective is definitely, let's just get kids involved and let them play. And one of the, we did a survey last year, we interviewed 10,000 parents in India, in urban India. And one of the challenges that came out unanimously was the parents just wanted their kids to go out and play. They're just using the tablets and iPhones and iPads and so on, and they're so integrated in the technology. And when I was young, I remember we had a different problem. Our parents wanted us to come back and study, right? So our objectives are definitely for increasing participation, increasing the base that is playing, and then it'll kind of go up the pyramid, and when we have better athletes and so on. So definitely pays off. The more elite investment, which is either governments or organizations like Reliance and so on, the objectives are more visible, right? For example, Indian players playing in Europe, India playing the World Cup, women's team doing well, the rankings going up, and so on. And unfortunately, none of these parameters are necessarily directly proportional to the investment, right? We might be investing a lot, but Philippines might be investing a lot as well, or Singapore might be investing a lot. We might not make it to the World Cup. And hence, lots of people start questioning the investment. So based on objectives, definitely of the belief that it pays off. But if the objectives are more elite in nature, the results need to be more visible. Otherwise, the investment starts getting questioned.
Harvey, 80-20, 20-80, 50-50? Where
Eric,
should the money go?
The examples you mentioned, let it be Singapore with their ICC, let it be China with a national strategy of investing in football, stimulating it with cash, with infrastructure, or let's say the Philippines philosophy of neutralizing players. These are different concepts and different angles to address how to promote football and eventually let it help the country to develop. I think we need to come back to the word system. It's always part of an ecosystem, what is happening in your country for talent development. Elite sports, does it work? Does it pay off? Absolutely. If you look at Germany with their Leistungscenter centers, their training centers that they've managed to set up all across the country, really stimulated the transition of players from that level to the professional level. If you look at Belgium, they have also set up fantastic programs that gathers the top players from the country and help them evolve into a better professional player. But we cannot forget, without the grassroots, without the strong stimulation, the pool of players that are educated and should be educated in the same essence and philosophy as the elite centers and as the elite institutions, this will not work. It's never about a person, it's never about one program that is leading a success. It's always an ecosystem and the people around this ecosystem. When you look at Belgium's success from 2002, ranking, I think, number 86th in the world, and now to the latest FIFA ranking, number 1 in the world, this happened with, of course, the elite, but with diligent work and the professional organization of the grassroots. We had the privilege to design together the architecture of Belgian football from 2002, together with the likes of Michel Sablon, with Bob Broes, and we defined what does it mean running an academy in Belgium. Not only this was implemented to the professional clubs, we were funded by the Flemish government, WFS, as third-party advisors to help 450 grassroots clubs in Belgium to organize themselves, run themselves, and operate just as well as a professional club in Belgium. They might not be very well equipped, they might not be very well resourced, but the human resource can be educated and they can do a very good job. Now Belgium runs, I think, one of the world's best grassroots system, and it's this grassroots system that contributes to the elite system that makes the elite system one of the best in the world.
Great. We're almost out of time, so I have one final question. Investment in sports, everybody knows it's very important. Government spending is very important. And we see more and more that governments launching their 20 or 30 years blueprints towards development of facilities and their sports strategy. But if we're looking at the consumption of sport these days, where children or the younger generations actually just listening or looking at seconds of highlights when they watch a football game, it's not even more minutes and so on. My question is, what's the sport development of the future? And are these blueprints to invest into long-term really relevant? Because maybe in 10 years we don't have fans going to the stadiums anymore, or it's old blocks like myself watching the games live, while everybody else is doing things on their mobile phones.
Well, I think in India we have no option but to look at a long-term plan because we don't really require a small tweak in our strategy, or a 1 or 2 or 4 or 5 year plan will actually not make a serious impact. Of course, we run the risk of doing a long-term vision and a long-term strategy, and the demand or the consumption of people changing altogether. However, if it's not the long-term way, it's actually no way that's going to work in India's perspective.
Okay. Just a quick one.
I think it will absolutely be relevant. I think more and more this will be relevant with globalization all around the world. We see people moving more and more. We see people migrating to a second home. We see people coming back to their home country. Football is a mean to express yourself. Football is a mean to represent yourself. If you would like to find a sense of belonging, if you would like to find a community that you can identify your DNA with, football is the most passionate and the most attractive way to do this. In Australia, we've seen in 20 years, immigrants from all around the world have settled into the Australian lifestyle, yet they look for football, and when they look for football, they look for their home country in an immigrant country like Australia. When you look at Uzbekistan, football is going great, and this is going together with country developing and opening up more and more. I think this is a trend. It's a necessary trend.
So Domeka, we're still going to watch football in the stadium in the next 10 years?
Yeah, of course. And I'm planning to make sure that my son will actually come with me and watch and enjoy the stadium atmosphere. I think in the end, long-term planning is still important, especially strategically. But I think what's going to change in the next few years is the way to get to those strategic objectives are going to change. You're going to have to review them probably a lot sooner than we're used to because of how people are absorbing content. Like you said, it's all about highlights and seconds and not minutes and not hours anymore.
Great. Well, this is the end of our session, so I would like to thank Harvey, Vivek and Domeka here
Eric,
for this panel on sports development and sports investment and country development. And thank you very much. We move on in the program. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen.